Helsinki, November 30th, 1961. President Urho Kekkonen sat alone in his office at the presidential palace, staring at the letter that had arrived from Moscow that morning. Outside, early winter darkness had already fallen over the Finnish capital, but inside, the tension was suffocating. The Soviet note, signed by Nikita Khrushchev himself, suggested immediate military consultations under the terms of the 1948 Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. In diplomatic language, it was hardly a suggestion. Kekkonen knew exactly what this meant. Soviet tanks had rolled into Budapest 5 years earlier. The Berlin Wall had gone up just 3 months ago. And now Moscow was calling in Finland's treaty obligations, ostensibly to discuss defense against West German militarism. The president understood the real message. Step out of line, and Finland's fate would mirror Hungary's. What the KGB officers monitoring Finland's response didn't know, what even Kekkonen's own cabinet didn't fully grasp, was that the Finnish president was about to execute the most delicate diplomatic maneuver of the Cold War. Over the next 2 months, he would travel to a hunting lodge in Siberia, share vodka with Khrushchev, and emerge with something unprecedented. A Soviet withdrawal of their demands, secured not through military might or Western backing, but through the sheer force of diplomatic finesse. Finland would remain free. Neither Soviet satellite nor NATO member, but something the Cold War wasn't supposed to allow. Genuinely neutral and genuinely independent. When the smoke cleared from World War II in 1945, Finland found itself in an impossible position that both superpowers initially misunderstood. The Soviets viewed Finland through the lens of their recent war experience. Here was a nation that had fought alongside Nazi Germany, inflicted devastating casualties on the Red Army, and still possessed a functioning democracy and capitalist economy just kilometers from Leningrad. To Stalin, Finland represented either a future satellite state or a future threat. Finland is a special case, Stalin told Molotov in 1944, according to declassified Soviet records. They fought well, too well. We need them pacified, but not so crushed that we create another Hungary waiting to happen. The Americans, meanwhile, saw Finland as already lost. George Kennan, architect of containment policy, wrote in his famous Long Telegram of 1946 that Finland was within the natural Soviet sphere of influence and not worth contesting. The State Department's initial assessment was blunt. Finland would be communist within 5 years, either through internal subversion or external pressure. Western investment should be minimal, diplomatic support cautious. We must recognize, Secretary of State Dean Acheson told President Truman in 1949, that Finland's geography determines its destiny. We cannot save them, even if we tried. What both sides failed to understand was that Finland possessed something neither superpower fully anticipated. A political class steeled by decades of precarious independence, willing to make extraordinary sacrifices to avoid becoming anyone's satellite. The Finns had fought the Winter War of 1939-40, holding off Soviet invasion for 105 days, despite being outnumbered 3-1. They had then endured the Continuation War of 1941-44, fighting alongside Germany not out of ideological affinity, but desperate pragmatism. And they had paid catastrophic reparations, $300 million in 1938 dollars, equivalent to paying off the entire Soviet war debt in goods and materials. Finnish politicians believed they could navigate between the superpowers by being simultaneously valuable and unthreatening to Moscow, while maintaining genuine democratic institutions and market economics. The strategy had a name, Paasikivi-Kekkonen line, after the two presidents who would define it. As President Juho Paasikivi explained in 1948, we must show the Soviet Union that Finland is no threat, but we must also show the West that we are not their puppet. These are not contradictory goals. They are two sides of survival. The initial Western perception was that this was impossible naivety. The CIA's 1948 assessment of Finland predicted current Finnish efforts to maintain independence through accommodation with USSR will fail within 18 to 24 months. Communist elements will exploit parliamentary system to seize power, or Soviet pressure will force coalition government accepting Moscow direction. The Soviets had their own assumptions. KGB planning documents from 1949 outlined three scenarios: outright annexation, rejected as too provocative to the West; a communist coup, viewed as feasible within 2 to 3 years; or a compliant coalition government that would effectively follow Soviet foreign policy direction. What they didn't anticipate was that Finland would develop a unique form of sovereignty. Constrained but real, limited but genuine. The architecture of Finland's impossible balancing act was constructed in the immediate aftermath of World War II, built on foundations of defeat, pragmatism, and extraordinary political discipline. The 1944 armistice with the Soviet Union had been brutal. Finland ceded 10% of its territory, including the entire Karelian Isthmus and the city of Viipuri, displacing 400,000 Finnish citizens. The reparations burden was crushing. Soviet troops occupied a naval base at Porkala, just 20 kilometers from Helsinki, creating a permanent reminder of Moscow's proximity. But the true test came in 1948, when Stalin proposed the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. The draft Moscow sent to Helsinki was nearly identical to treaties imposed on Romania, Hungary, and Poland. Treaties that had paved the way for communist takeovers. The proposed text included provisions for Soviet military bases in peacetime, Soviet advisors in the Finnish military, and automatic Finnish military cooperation with the USSR against any aggressor. President Paasikivi, a conservative banker who had negotiated with Lenin in 1918 and Stalin in 1944, understood exactly what was at stake. He assembled a small team of negotiators and formulated a counter-proposal that would become the template for Finnish survival. As he told his closest advisors, "We cannot refuse a treaty, that would be suicide. But we can negotiate a treaty that allows us to breathe." The Finnish counter-draft made subtle but crucial changes. Military cooperation would be consultative rather than automatic. No permanent Soviet bases beyond Porkala. No Soviet military advisors. Most critically, Finland would maintain its own defense forces and internal security apparatus, unlike the Eastern European satellites, where Soviet officers effectively controlled both. The final treaty, signed on April 6, 1948, represented an unprecedented Soviet compromise. For the first time, Stalin had accepted a border state maintaining genuine military independence. The architect of making this treaty work in practice was Urho Kekkonen, first as prime minister and then as president from 1956 to 1981. Kekkonen, a lawyer and athlete who had competed in the 1924 Olympics, developed what observers called active neutrality, a foreign policy that actively courted Soviet trust while maintaining democratic institutions the Soviets detested. His method was personal diplomacy taken to extraordinary lengths. Kekkonen learned Russian fluently, developed personal relationships with Soviet leaders from Khrushchev to Brezhnev, and traveled to Moscow more frequently than any other Western leader. "I go to the bear's cave," he said, "so the bear doesn't come to mine." But Kekkonen also enforced strict limits on what Finland would and wouldn't do. When the Soviets suggested in 1958 that Finland join the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, Kekkonen refused, proposing instead a bilateral trade agreement that maintained Finland's separate economy. When Moscow hinted that Finnish Communist Party representation in government should increase, Kekkonen ensured coalition governments included communists only when mathematically necessary, and excluded them from key ministries like defense and foreign affairs. The domestic political price was high. Kekkonen's critics, silenced more by social pressure than legal restriction, called it Finlandization, a term that became Cold War shorthand for excessive deference to Soviet interests. The government exercised informal censorship over media coverage of the Soviet Union, discouraging stories about human rights abuses or foreign policy criticism. When Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago was published in 1973, Finnish authorities quietly discouraged its distribution, though they never formally banned it. "We practice self-censorship," admitted one Finnish newspaper editor in a confidential 1970 interview with CIA officers. "Not because the government demands it, but because we understand the alternative. If the Soviets believe we're hostile, we lose everything. So we bite our tongues about things that don't affect Finland directly." The Western response evolved from dismissal to grudging respect. NATO planners wrote off Finland as Soviet-dominated until the late 1960s, when intelligence assessments began recognizing something more complex. A 1969 CIA analysis noted, "Finland has succeeded in maintaining democratic institutions, market economy, and Western cultural orientation while satisfying Soviet security concerns." This represents the most successful example of small state neutrality in the Soviet near abroad. By the 1970s, Finland had become something neither superpower initially thought possible. A prosperous democracy maintaining neutrality through a combination of military preparedness. Finnish conscription produced reserves of 500,000 trained soldiers. Economic pragmatism, balanced trade with East and West, and diplomatic acrobatics that kept Moscow reassured without becoming a satellite. The moment that would define Finland's Cold War survival came in October 1961, when Nikita Khrushchev decided to test how far Finnish independence actually extended. The Berlin crisis was escalating. The wall had just gone up, and Moscow was pressuring neutral states across Europe to demonstrate their alignment. The Note crisis, as Finns would call it, represented the closest Finland came to losing its independence without a shot being fired. October 30, 1961. Moscow Khrushchev summoned the Finnish ambassador and handed him a diplomatic note invoking Article 2 of the 1948 treaty, the Military Consultation Clause. The note cited increased West German militarism and NATO preparations for aggression as justification for immediate military talks. The ambassador, who had been expecting a routine meeting, felt his stomach drop as he read the implications. Military consultations could mean Soviet troops on Finnish soil. They could mean pressure to accept Soviet military advisors. They could mean the end of Finnish independence. The note was deliberately vague about what consultations would entail, and that ambiguity was itself a weapon. KGB assessments of Finland, declassified in the 1990s, reveal that Khrushchev had multiple objectives. He wanted to test whether Finland would accept Soviet military presence during the Berlin crisis. He wanted to pressure the Scandinavian countries, particularly Norway, by showing that even neutral Finland wasn't safe from Soviet demands. And he wanted to undermine President Kekkonen, who had been resisting Soviet pressure to exclude certain opposition politicians from Finnish elections. November 15, 1961, Helsinki. The Finnish political establishment fractured immediately. The opposition Social Democrats and Conservatives demanded that Finland refuse consultations and seek Western support. Some younger politicians openly advocated moving toward NATO membership, arguing that neutrality had failed to protect Finland from Soviet pressure. "This is the moment we've always feared," one opposition leader told Parliament. "Moscow is calling in its markers. They want to turn us into another Poland, and were watching it happen in slow motion. Kekkonen faced an impossible calculation. Refusing Soviet consultations violated the treaty and could provoke military intervention. Accepting them might lead to permanent Soviet military presence. But the president had been studying Khrushchev's psychology for 5 years and believed he detected something in the note's timing and phrasing. This was a test, not a predetermined assault. On November 15th, Kekkonen made a move that stunned both Moscow and his own government. He contacted the Soviet embassy and proposed that instead of formal military consultations in Moscow with delegations and protocols, he would come personally to meet Khrushchev informally, as a friend visiting a friend, to discuss Soviet security concerns. Then, without waiting for Moscow's response, he announced publicly that he was taking a vacation in the Soviet Union to ease tensions through personal diplomacy. November 18-25, 1961. Novosibirsk, Siberia. Khrushchev, intrigued by this unprecedented approach, invited Kekkonen to a government hunting lodge outside Novosibirsk, thousands of kilometers from Moscow and from any diplomatic infrastructure. For 7 days, the two men hunted, drank vodka, and negotiated Finland's fate in conversations that were never officially recorded, but later reconstructed from both leaders' private accounts. Kekkonen's strategy was to reframe the entire premise of the crisis. Rather than debating military consultations, he focused on reassuring Khrushchev about Finland's fundamental reliability, while simultaneously warning about the consequences of Soviet overreach. His pitch, delivered over hunting rifles and dinner tables, went roughly like this. Nikita Sergeyevich, you don't need military consultations to secure Soviet borders. Finland's army, 500,000 men when mobilized, already serves your interests by making Western military operations across Finnish territory impossible. But if you force military consultations now, you will destroy the domestic consensus in Finland that makes neutrality possible. The opposition will grow stronger. Pressure for NATO membership will become unstoppable. You will turn a reliable buffer state into a hostile border. Kekkonen had brought detailed intelligence about Finnish public opinion, military capabilities, and opposition politics, essentially opening Finland's books to demonstrate both reliability and the fragility of the political arrangement. He described how Finland's conscription system, universal for all men, created a citizen army that would fight to defend neutrality against any aggressor, including the Soviet Union, if pushed. We fought you in 1939, Kekkonen reminded Khrushchev, referencing the Winter War. We can fight you again, but we don't want to. We want to be your friend, your buffer, your trading partner. Military consultations destroy that. They push us toward the West. The breakthrough came on the 5th day, November 22nd, when Khrushchev admitted the real concern: West Germany's rearmament and NATO's forward positioning in Norway, combined with his uncertainty about whether Finland's opposition politicians might try to pivot toward the West if they gained power. Kekkonen seized on this opening. He couldn't prevent West German rearmament, but he could personally guarantee Finland's neutrality would survive any change in government. I will tell the Finnish people directly that our security depends on Soviet trust, Kekkonen proposed. I will call early elections. Let the Finnish voters demonstrate that they support neutrality. You will see that this policy has popular support, not just my personal support. Khrushchev, according to his later accounts, found this approach both novel and reassuring. Unlike Eastern European leaders who came to Moscow as supplicants, Kekkonen was offering Soviet security through Finnish democracy rather than in spite of it. On November 25th, over a final dinner, Khrushchev made an announcement that shocked the Soviet delegation. He was withdrawing the consultation request. Finland had passed the test. Military talks were unnecessary because, and here Khrushchev's phrasing was crucial, President Kekkonen has shown that Finland understands and respects Soviet security interests. December 1961, January 1962. Aftermath. When Kekkonen returned to Helsinki, he immediately called for parliamentary elections, fulfilling his promise to Khrushchev, but also gambling that Finnish voters would support his approach. The January 1962 elections became a referendum on neutrality. Despite opposition criticism that Kekkonen had submitted to Soviet bullying, his coalition won decisively. Finnish voters, understanding exactly what was at stake, chose the tightrope over confrontation. In Washington, President Kennedy's advisors struggled to interpret what had happened. A State Department analysis from December 1961 concluded, Kekkonen's personal diplomacy appears to have succeeded where traditional approaches would have failed. However, this success depends entirely on one man's relationship with Khrushchev and sets a dangerous precedent of Soviet interference in Finnish internal affairs through informal pressure. But in Helsinki, the lesson was different. Finland had faced the maximum Soviet pressure short of military invasion, and survived through a combination of military credibility, economic value to the USSR, and diplomatic skill. The note crisis became the template for managing future Soviet pressure. Acknowledge legitimate security concerns, offer reassurance through action rather than rhetoric, but never surrender the core elements of Finnish sovereignty. The note crisis fundamentally altered how both superpowers approached Finland and how Finland positioned itself in the Cold War. Over the following 2 decades, each side refined its approach based on what the crisis revealed about Finland's unique position and the limits of superpower influence. American and Western evolution. Washington's initial dismissal of Finland as a lost cause gradually transformed into recognition that Finlandization, despite its pejorative connotations, represented a viable form of neutrality worth preserving. By the mid-1960s, State Department policy shifted from writing off Finland to actively supporting its economic independence as a buffer against direct Soviet expansion into Scandinavia. The Kennedy administration, learning from the note crisis, quietly began treating Finland as a special case. A classified 1963 National Security Council directive, declassified in 1998, stated, U.S. policy toward Finland should recognize that Finnish neutrality, while constrained by Soviet proximity, serves Western interests by preventing direct Soviet control of strategic Baltic territory. We should support Finnish economic ties to the West without actions that would provoke Soviet intervention. This translated into concrete support. American corporations were encouraged to invest in Finland. When Finland sought to join the European Free Trade Association, (EFTA), in 1961, the U.S. supported the application despite Soviet objections. Trade between Finland and Western Europe expanded from $400 million in 1960 to over $2 billion by 1970, giving Finland economic leverage that constrained Soviet pressure. NATO's approach evolved similarly. Norwegian and Danish military planners initially viewed Finland as hostile territory to be contained, but by the 1970s, Nordic defense cooperation included informal Finnish participation. Though Finland would never join NATO, Finnish military intelligence shared information about Soviet naval activities in the Baltic, and Finnish purchase of Western military equipment, including British jets and French missiles, created interoperability that NATO quietly noted in its contingency planning. We came to understand, a retired U.S. ambassador to Finland explained in a 1989 interview, that Finland's independence was maintained not despite its relationship with Moscow, but through it. The Finns had found a way to make themselves more valuable free than controlled. Soviet and Eastern Bloc countermoves. Moscow's response to the note crisis was to institutionalize the informal arrangement Kekkonen had proposed. Rather than pushing for formal Soviet control mechanisms, Soviet policy shifted toward ensuring that Finnish leaders understood and respected what the Soviets called the realities of geography. The KGB established extensive operations in Finland. More than 300 intelligence officers operated under diplomatic cover in Helsinki during the 1970s, the highest concentration anywhere outside NATO countries. But their mission wasn't subversion or coup planning. Declassified KGB documents reveal instructions to monitor Finnish political developments, cultivate relationships with key politicians across all parties, and report any signs of anti-Soviet orientation. The goal was early warning, not control. Soviet economic policy toward Finland became surprisingly sophisticated. Rather than extracting resources or imposing disadvantageous trade terms, as with Eastern European satellites, the USSR made Finland its primary Western trading partner. By 1975, over 20% of Finnish trade was with the Soviet Union, creating mutual economic dependence. Finland exported industrial equipment, ships, and consumer goods the Soviet economy couldn't produce efficiently. In return, Finland imported Soviet oil and natural gas at stable prices, insulating Finnish industry from OPEC price shocks that hammered Western Europe in the 1970s. The Soviets learned that you can buy reliability, observed a Finnish trade minister in a confidential 1976 discussion. They give us economic stability we couldn't find anywhere else, and we give them political predictability. It's not friendship, it's mutual calculation. Leonid Brezhnev, who succeeded Khrushchev in 1964, developed his own relationship with Kekkonen, meeting the Finnish president 23 times between 1964 and 1981. These meetings, often at Brezhnev's hunting lodge outside Moscow, became ritualized reassurance ceremonies. Brezhnev would express Soviet security concerns about NATO, about West Germany, about American missiles. Kekkonen would explain how Finnish neutrality addressed those concerns. Both men would reaffirm that the 1948 treaty was sufficient and no additional Soviet presence in Finland was necessary. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 represented the peak of this arrangement's success from Moscow's perspective. The Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, held in Helsinki and attended by 35 nations, including the US and USSR, essentially ratified post-World War II European borders, a key Soviet objective. Finland's role as host demonstrated that neutrality could serve Soviet interests. The Final Act's human rights provisions, which would later undermine Soviet authority, seemed less important than the strategic recognition of Soviet security interests. Third parties and unintended consequences. Sweden, Finland's western neighbor and fellow neutral, watched the Finnish balancing act with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. Swedish neutrality was based on staying equidistant from both superpowers. But Finland's example showed that geographic proximity to the USSR required accepting asymmetric constraints. Swedish defense planning in the 1960s and 70s explicitly included scenarios of defending Swedish territory if Finland fell under Soviet control, while also maintaining unofficial coordination with Finnish forces. "We are brothers in neutrality," one Swedish foreign minister said privately. "But they walk the tightrope while we stand on firm ground. Their balance is more impressive and more precarious." West Germany developed a complex relationship with Finland. On one hand, Finnish trade with East Germany and diplomatic recognition of the GDR, granted under Soviet pressure in 1973, irritated Bonn. On the other hand, Finland demonstrated that even states in Moscow's shadow could maintain market economies and democratic systems. When Chancellor Willy Brandt developed Ostpolitik, West Germany's policy of engagement with the East, he studied the Finnish model of managing relations with Moscow without surrendering sovereignty. The term Finlandization itself became a weapon in Western European politics. Critics of détente in the 1970s used it as shorthand for dangerous accommodation with Soviet power. When British Prime Minister James Callaghan faced pressure to reduce UK nuclear weapons in 1977, conservative critics warned against Finlandization of British defence policy. The term's pejorative use bothered Finns, who saw it as misrepresenting their achievement of maintaining independence against enormous pressure. Perhaps the most significant unintended consequence was the model Finland provided for other small states. Austria's neutrality, formalized in 1955, consciously borrowed elements of the Finnish approach. Yugoslavia's non-aligned status under Tito referenced Finnish balancing. Even after the Cold War, countries like Belarus and Ukraine would struggle with similar dynamics, though without Finland's success in maintaining genuine democracy and Western orientation while managing Russian security concerns. By 1980, Finland had become what neither superpower initially anticipated: a prosperous Western democracy that maintained correct, even friendly relations with the Soviet Union without becoming a satellite. Finnish GDP per capita exceeded the UK's. Political freedoms remained intact. Trade with both East and West flourished. The military maintained credible defensive capabilities with 700,000 mobilizable reserves and modern equipment from multiple sources. But the balance remained delicate, dependent on personal relationships, mutual economic interest, and both superpowers accepting that this anomalous arrangement served their interests better than forcing Finland into one camp or the other. The apex of Finland's Cold War balancing act, and the moment that revealed both its strength and its limitations, came during the Euro missile crisis of 1979-1983. When the Soviet Union deployed SS-20 intermediate-range nuclear missiles targeting Western Europe, and NATO responded with plans to deploy Pershing the Scud and cruise missiles in West Germany, the Benelux, and Italy, Finland found itself in an impossible position that tested whether 2 decades of carefully constructed neutrality could survive the renewed superpower confrontation. December 1979, March 1980. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 shattered détente and placed Finland under immediate pressure. The U.S. announced a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics and demanded Western allies follow suit. President Jimmy Carter's administration sent a clear message to neutral countries. Sitting on the fence was no longer acceptable. You were either with the free world or complicit in Soviet aggression. Finnish President Kekkonen, now 80 years old and in declining health, faced demands from both sides. The Reagan administration, taking office in January 1981, pressed Finland to demonstrate Western alignment by joining the Olympic boycott, reducing trade with the USSR, and supporting sanctions. Moscow simultaneously demanded that Finland publicly condemn NATO's Euromissile deployment and consider allowing Soviet military observers to monitor potential NATO activity in northern Scandinavia. Kekkonen's response demonstrated the Finnish approach at its most refined and most cynical, depending on perspective. Finland announced it would compete in the Moscow Olympics because sports should not be politicized, a position that angered Washington but satisfied Moscow. However, Finland's Olympic team marched without its national flag, and the Finnish anthem wasn't played, a symbolic gesture acknowledging Western concerns while technically complying with Soviet expectations. On the Euro missile question, Finland walked an even finer line. In public statements, Finnish leaders called for restraint on both sides and supported arms control negotiations, positioning Finland as genuinely neutral. In private communications to Moscow, released from Soviet archives in the 1990s, Finnish diplomats offered detailed reassurances that Finland would never allow its territory to be used for NATO military purposes and would maintain its treaty obligations to the USSR. But to Washington, Finland quietly signaled that Finnish military intelligence was tracking Soviet submarine activity in the Baltic and sharing information with Swedish counterparts, who in turn shared selectively with NATO. Finland also accelerated purchases of Western military equipment, spending $300 million on British and French systems between 1980 and 1983, demonstrating that Finnish neutrality didn't mean military alignment with the USSR. The peak moment came in November 1981, when Brezhnev, in failing health like Kekkonen, made his final visit to Helsinki to commemorate the 35th anniversary of the 1948 treaty. The meeting of the two dying architects of Finnish-Soviet accommodation became a symbolic passing of an era. Brezhnev, in remarks that were unusually direct for public consumption, told Finnish leaders, "Finland has shown that a small country can maintain its independence and dignity while respecting legitimate security interests of a great power. This is the model of peaceful coexistence." Kekkonen, responding, defended Finland's approach in terms that revealed both pride and awareness of the costs. "We have paid a price for our independence, the price of constant vigilance, of self-restraint, of understanding that geography is not negotiable. But we have preserved what matters most: the right to decide our own affairs, to maintain our democratic institutions, to prosper as we see fit. This is not submission, it is the wisdom of survival." 1982-1984. The succession crisis. When Kekkonen finally resigned in October 1981 due to declining health, dying in 1986, the question of whether Finlandization could survive its architect became acute. The KGB had cultivated relationships across the Finnish political spectrum, but worried that new leadership might try to pivot toward fuller Western alignment. Declassified Soviet documents reveal that the Politburo seriously debated whether to pressure Finland to guarantee continuity of foreign policy before accepting Kekkonen's successor. President Mauno Koivisto, who took office in January 1982, faced the challenge of maintaining the Kekkonen approach while demonstrating independence from Soviet dictation. His solution was subtle but significant. He maintained all substantive aspects of Finnish neutrality and the Soviet relationship, but refused to engage in the personal diplomacy theater that had characterized the Kekkonen era. No more hunting trips with Soviet leaders. No more informal meetings where Finland's fate was decided over vodka. Instead, Koivisto institutionalized neutrality through formal diplomatic channels, making Finnish policy less dependent on personal relationships. This worked partly because the Soviet Union was entering its own period of gerontocratic decline. Brezhnev died in November 1982, followed by Andropov in 1984 and Chernenko in 1985. The rapid succession of Soviet leaders meant no one had time to develop the personal relationship with Finnish leaders that had characterized the Khrushchev-Kekkonen and Brezhnev-Kekkonen eras. By the time Gorbachev took power in 1985, the Cold War itself was entering its final phase. Quantifying success, by the mid-1980s, Finland's achievement could be measured in concrete terms that revealed both success and compromise. Economic independence. Finland's GDP per capita reached $17,000 by 1985, higher than the UK, $2,500, or Spain, $8,000, and approaching Nordic neighbors like Sweden, $19,000. Trade was balanced, 21% with the Soviet Union, 45% with Western Europe, 24% with other markets. Finnish technology companies like Nokia had begun expanding globally. Political freedom. Finland consistently ranked among the world's freest societies in independent assessments. Voter turnout averaged 75 to 80%. Multi-party democracy functioned without Soviet interference in electoral mechanics, even if informal Soviet pressure influenced which politicians rose to leadership positions. Military capability. Finland maintained one of Europe's largest reserve forces, 700,000 trained personnel in a nation of 5 million, equipped with weapons from Sweden, France, Britain, and even limited U.S. systems. Military spending ran 1.52% of GDP, higher than many NATO countries in peacetime. The costs. Media self-censorship regarding Soviet human rights abuses remained pervasive. Academic and cultural exchanges with the Soviet Union received government support, while similar Western programs faced bureaucratic obstacles. Soviet intelligence operated freely in Finland with minimal countermeasures, and Finnish foreign policy remained constrained. Finland could not join the European Economic Community, the EU's predecessor, without Soviet permission, which was never granted during the Cold War. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, Finland faced an identity crisis that revealed what its Cold War balancing act had truly achieved, and what it had cost. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union collapsed. The 1948 treaty became obsolete, and Finland suddenly confronted a question it had avoided for 45 years. Who were the Finns when the tightrope disappeared? The answer came swiftly. In 1995, Finland joined the European Union, an impossibility during the Cold War due to Soviet objections. Finnish troops participated in international peacekeeping operations globally, freed from constraints about appearing too Western-aligned. Most dramatically, in 2023, Finland joined NATO, ending neutrality entirely in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The fact that Russia, weakened and distracted, could do nothing to prevent this demonstrated how much Finnish policy had been shaped by Soviet power, rather than genuine commitment to neutrality. Yet, historians now recognize that Finland's Cold War experience represents something unique in the superpower confrontation. A small democracy that maintained sovereignty through accommodation without becoming a puppet. The contrast with Eastern European nations is stark. While Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland suffered Soviet tanks enforcing compliance, Finland negotiated its survival. While East Germany became a police state, Finland held free elections. While Romania's economy stagnated under communism, Finland prospered with market capitalism. "We practiced the art of the possible," explained President Martti Ahtisaari in a 1997 interview, reflecting on the Cold War decades. "We couldn't be what we wanted to be. Fully Western, fully integrated with Europe, fully free in foreign policy. But we could be more than Moscow wanted us to be. Democratic, prosperous, culturally Western, and ultimately independent. That narrow space between what we wanted and what Moscow would tolerate became our country." The lessons of Finnish survival extend beyond the Cold War. Small nations adjacent to great powers face asymmetric constraints that no amount of idealism can eliminate. Geography imposes realities that must be managed rather than wished away. But the Finnish experience also demonstrates that even under enormous pressure, space exists for agency, creativity, and the preservation of core values if leaders are willing to be flexible about form while protecting substance. The term Finlandization, once pejorative, has been partially reclaimed. In the 21st century, countries from Ukraine to Taiwan study Finland's balancing act as they navigate their own proximity to powerful neighbors. The model doesn't provide easy answers. Finland's success required specific conditions, including valuable trade relationships, credible military capabilities, skilled diplomacy, and frankly, some luck in timing. But it proves that the binary choice between submission and confrontation isn't always the only option. Back in that presidential office in November 1961, when Urho Kekkonen stared at Khrushchev's note demanding military consultations, the easiest paths were either submission or defiance. Finland chose a third way, more difficult, more delicate, requiring constant vigilance and moral compromise, but ultimately preserving what mattered most. For 45 years, Finland walked the tightrope between East and West without falling into either camp. In the nuclear age, when one misstep could have meant national extinction, That achievement of balance deserves recognition not just as diplomatic skill, but as a distinctive form of courage.